Here I am talking to John Grinder, and the first topic today is going to be on language acquisition. John, you speak 8 languages, I believe?
I speak conversational level 8 languages, and I'm very close to my 9th one. I'm working on Japanese.
Okay, Japanese. Yeah. So eight languages, close to 9. Some of the questions I'm going to be asking today is regarding John's ability to acquire languages in the way he has done, and how that is actually transferable as a skill, particularly using NLP modelling, so other people can learn from you, John, and from our team, and Carmen, how we can acquire languages fluently. And what we're going to call first fluency. But just to start off with, the first question is, what is the secret, John? 8 languages?
Practice. Discipline to practice is like any sport, an exercise, in this case in neurology. There are shortcuts, there are accelerated strategies, there's ways of making the whole thing happen significantly faster. But deep underneath is a commitment, and the discipline to carry out the commitment to actually practice.
So from when I was about 8 years of age, approximately to the age of 16, I sat through French classes in school. And we went through verb structures and tense structures and nouns.
Notice all meta language. You didn't do that in French.
No.
You talked about French
Exactly.
in English. And you didn't speak French, you talked about the structure of French.
Indeed. So I found myself in France.
Good luck.
Stuck. Having spent all these years learning French. Now, obviously, when we're young, we acquire a language rapidly.
I will contest that, but okay. Let's let it pass for the moment.
Well, slightly faster than my French experience.
Certainly.
So what would you say is the difference in the way that you have learned a language and perhaps the orthodox style of teaching it formally in the education system?
Oh, well, let me comment directly on that. Somebody has done a brilliant design. The only way and the only experience in the world I've ever witnessed, including my own experience with French in high school, with a similar result when I got to Paris, the only way that we could be exposed to as much foreign language as we're typically exposed to in high school and university and not learn it is the way it's taught. This really cycles back to your question about, kids are the best learners, including at languages. Now there's a trick. What is it about children that make them so superb at the rapid assimilation of complex patterning, including language? Well, first of all, notice just in passing that extremely well-educated, well-prepared researchers in linguistics, for example, have spent hundreds of years attempting to describe the structure, phonology, syntax, or semantics of different natural languages. And thus far, it's been a complete failure. That is, there is not even a coherent subset of any natural language which has been successfully so described. Yet, anybody with a testable IQ, roughly 50 or above, according to these strange rituals called IQ tests, will, in a relatively short period of time, a couple of years, acquire full fluency in the language that they happen to be embedded in contextually. Chomsky has made a great exploitation of this simple observation and concludes from it something which I think has interesting value to consider, that we're wired. This is no blank slate that arrives in the form of this wailing little child, this infant, but a pre-programmed organism who has built-in filters and sophisticated inductive processes for finding pattern recognition circuitry, which makes them particularly alert to, responsive to, and competent in the acquisition of these complex things called natural language. So if we buy for a moment this particular way of thinking about it, the easiest way to describe the strategy I've employed in acquiring what I have acquired is I become a child again. Now in more formal language, technical language in NLP, This is the ability to select and sustain what we call a know-nothing state. This know-nothing state appears in our work in NLP, both historically and through up until the present, as the ability to set aside, when you choose, on demand, the knowledge base. Let's characterize it as the neurologically registered maps, internal maps, which are our best guess in making sense about cumulative experience over decades and decades. If we can learn to set that aside, we've removed one of the two differences between a child and an adult.
So our current language systems.
Yes. So if among all of the knowledge base we set aside is access to our native language or any language we already achieved fluency in, we've removed a source of the necessity to compare and to make congruent the incoming data stream from French, from Italian, from Tibetan, from Kiswahili, with the already registered map called, in our case, American and British English. A child, in part, is a superior learner simply because they don't have to make that comparison with material already assimilated and put into patterns. So by achieving this strange and quite, how shall I say, quite entertaining state of unconscious competency, in which unconscious assimilation of patterning can occur without any attempt to make sense of it, to understand it, and certainly with no requirement for comparing the input data stream full of patterning with patterns that we've already registered in our database. This comes in really a strong form, of course, in language learning. You asked me, and I gave you a response, how is it that people don't learn languages given the academic approach that's offered? I've already made my comment about it. One specific way in which that is true, of course, is just the phonological targets. You mentioned French. I also had several years of French from a teacher who didn't speak French. So we spent all our time at the middle level talking about the structure of French and then memorizing certain dialogues. That's as far as we got. Turns out his phonology was completely flawed. So much so that I had what is a very typical experience when I first arrived in France, in particular in Paris, where I trotted out my best attempts from these 2 years of studying French to communicate. And the consistent response was pardon. And it's not, the French have style. This is one of the things that I find really attractive about the French. They even have styles that I don't find attractive, but the fact that they have the freedom, it's almost like a birthright, as far as I can tell for the French, that you have the choice of developing your style. And people are quite tolerant is too strong a word, quite accepting of these individual variations. It's as if everyone has a right to choose a style, whether it's attractive or not. It's an evaluative proposition, but the right's there. So you find them quite accepting of this. At the same time, of all of the languages I've had any experience in, French has the tightest phonological targets. You hit those vowels or you miss them, and if you miss them, it just doesn't work.
So that will not come from textbook learning, that will only come from the experiencing of
direct
being
experience
around
of
native French speakers.
Of being immersed in the flow of French by native.
So a moment ago you mentioned know-nothing states. And there are many people who are watching this, perhaps even trained in NLP, may not be familiar with a know-nothing state. From a new code NLP perspective, could you please offer a description?
Well, better yet, I'll just give 3 places you can go to get them. Number one, if you work with a coach or anyone who has calibration skills as to the physiology and the state which it reflects, you can take the various games and activities of new code and run them. As anybody who's done this can attest, the exit state, the state that you exit from these games in, is something quite close to a know-nothing state. It's typical that there's no internal dialogue. It's typical that there is very little labeling linguistically. It's typical that there is no strong movement to achieve understanding. The experience itself has a richness and a texture to it, which is perfectly. And the states tend to be, of course, at least enhanced performance, if not high performance states, And typical of those, although there are classes of exceptions, for example, poetry and so forth, typical of those high performance or enhanced performance states, there is no need for conscious segmentation of an ongoing flow of experience. The experience itself is the thing in which we engage.
And is this a thing that you sort of recommend now for people who be learning languages, have access to these states of know-nothingness through high-performance new code games?
So, one source is the exit states coming out of these well-done, well-calibrated by a third party experiences of the new code games and activities. There are other places to go. Go find yourself, borrow a nice 18-month, 20-month-old baby who has a few goo-goo words at best, and get down on your knees, get down on the floor with this baby and do direct or lateralized mirroring for the next 10 minutes if you can last that long. Babies are in constant motion. Babies do not have internal dialogue. Babies do not have well-developed maps to the world in the strong sense that adults do.
Nor will they have the coded descriptions of their environment.
Nor will they have coded description of their environment, although there is a little caveat here. As you know, my daughter and her husband, people look on My Baby Can Talk, have created, there's several versions of this out in the world now, they themselves have created DVDs which teach infants starting between 7 and 8 months how to sign. For example, there's a lot of iconicity in American sign. So this sign, if you look at it, describes a part of an animal, namely the whiskers of a cat. In fact, this part of a cat now, through the becoming an icon, now becomes in its stylized form the sign for the animal itself, for the entire cat. It's quite remarkable to have an exchange. The family cat walks by, and as anybody who's been around infants know, they are totally engaged by animals. They recognize the difference between toys and animals. And as the cat walks by, the baby becomes excited and focuses on, and then turns to an adult. And if they have been afforded the opportunity to develop sign, they will then sign what it is that they see and register it. So this is the naming function. This is the most fundamental piece of language, natural language anyway. But then they will look at you, and if you're in the game, then of course you can repeat, and the communication is quite complete. Before 14 months, Jessica, my granddaughter, for example, had, I'd say 100 signs. So she began very quickly then to make the next step in language acquisition, which is the stringing together of tokens, in this case signs, in the case of spoken language words, in different orders. With different
Predominantly nouns.
meanings. Predominantly nouns? No.
Nouns and verbs.
For nouns and verbs. It's a nice mix. Anyway, that's an aside about a presupposition I think we've had since the beginning of time about babies. They're cute. They make messes. They make funny sounds and faces, and they're constantly smiling if they catch your eye. But the idea that they are capable, let's say at 7, 8 months, of organizing themselves to comment on their internal states, thirsty, hungry, or on external events like the cat walking by. This myth has been put to rest by baby sign.